In the 19th century, this country, the United States, faced two great challenges. And the first of them was slavery. It was a moral challenge. What to do about this issue which affects the dignity of the human spirit. Critical issue, but not answered easily in the 19th century. So we have a crisis that's moral and we have a crisis that's military, and that is the Civil War, the bloodiest struggle ever fought on this country, the aftershocks of which are still reverberating around us. So we've got a moral and we've got a military struggle. And what is extraordinary is to speak from this historic pulpit is to be saturated with the memory of the two figures who are responsible for this space around us. And both of them were at the vortex of the moral and military issues that I just mentioned. On the left is Reverend William Henry Furness, who was the principal minister of this church from 1825 to 1875, half a century, and the most historic half century I think this institution has ever faced. And there is his son, his youngest son, Frank Furness, who designed this building. After Reverend Furness had retired, but I think it's abundantly clear that the dialogue between father and the son are responsible for making this space, as we're about to see. Now, from the beginning, Reverend Furness, from the moment he arrived here from Harvard, he was Harvard squared, Harvard undergraduate, Harvard Theological Seminary. From the moment he came here, he confronted architecture. One of his first acts was to create a new building, a beautiful classical temple which is meant to be an emblem of clarity of form representing clarity of thought. There it is. It once stood on Locust Street, not far from his house. And for the first 15 or so years of his tenure at that church, at the pulpit that was the predecessor for this one, he steered clear of the issue of slavery. He did not bring up abolition. Abolition wasn't yet the burning political crisis that would have become with expansion and the settlement of the Louisiana Purchase. And he would have been aware of the building of this building around 6th and Race. This is the Pennsylvania Hall, which was built by abolitionist Quakers. Until this moment, till 1838, the banner of abolitionism in Philadelphia was held aloft by Quakers, not yet by Unitarians. The building was dedicated, actually that's my birthday, May 14th, 1838, and it stood for 3 days. And it was burned down by a violent mob, a murderous mob, probably the same mob that about 4 years later would burn down a number of Catholic churches at that end of the city. And I believe this was the moment that shocked Reverend Furness into speaking out about slavery. And he began to give his first anti-slavery sermons about a year later, 1839, a fateful year because that was the year that Frank, the architect's son, was born. We have a fabulous image of Reverend Furness speaking, painted by the great Philadelphia portraitist Thomas Sully. And you get something of the sense of the man from the portrait. He's holding his hand out, not in an extravagant, declamatory gesture. He's holding his hand upright as if to offer you a proposition. Please consider this. I give you this idea. It's not the hand that's out for fundraising purposes. I think we all know about that. But our hand is out today, if not his. Reverend Furness spoke from between the twin Doric columns of his church on Locust Street, week in, week out, and this was the moral education of his family in the front row, and it was young Frank sitting there, hearing his father's thundering words, who was awoken to the challenge of putting ideas into action. The father desperately wanted his children, all of his children, to go to Harvard. Only one of them did. Frank was headed for Harvard, but decided he chose action rather than thought. And what he got from his father, although not an academic path, he got he got the idea into his bones that to put your thoughts into brave action was a dangerous thing. This is one of the great moments in Philadelphia abolition. 10 years after the burning of Pennsylvania Hall, a group of Philadelphia abolitionists was involved in one of the most daring slave rescues of the 19th century. This is Henry Brown, slave in Richmond, who, after dealing with Philadelphia abolitionists, had himself mailed overnight in a box. Took a 27-hour journey to Philadelphia, where he was opened by a circle of Philadelphia abolitionists, including J. Miller McKim, father of Charles McKim, another architect. I marvel at the bravery of this. I also marvel that you could get an overnight package sent in 27 hours then. We still haven't cracked that. In the newspaper accounts of this, and there were many, we don't hear the name Reverend Furness, and I suspect it was suppressed at the time because it was dangerous for him to take a decided stand when his congregation was itself bitterly divided. Some of the members of his congregation had business interest in Delaware. Delaware is the walk of a couple hours, and it was still a slave state. So Reverend Furness did a brave thing when he started to speak abolition from his pulpit and sent a good many of his congregation heading straight out the front door. So Furness learned a moral lesson, but he also learned a human lesson about bravery. One other lesson he learned from his father: quick thinking. This is a grisly sight. This is December 2nd, 1859. This is the hanging of John Brown. John Brown was hanged after the raid at Harper's Ferry, and then the body was shipped to the family burial plot upstate in New Jersey, which meant that the body had to pass through Philadelphia. And although Philadelphia is a nominal city, it was filled with hundreds of young and angry Southerners. I don't think it's widely known, but one of the favorite places for Southern plantation owners, the wealthier ones, to send their sons to be educated was at a Philadelphia medical school. We were the leader in medical education then. In some sense, we still are. So anytime there was a prominent abolitionist event in Philadelphia, it was guaranteed to draw a ready-made mob of pro-slavery Southerners in the streets of Philadelphia. And they knew that the body of John Brown was coming to Philadelphia, and we did not have a direct connection then from Richmond to New York City. Trains stopped at Broad and Washington, and the passengers had to move to 9th and Green Street, where the Pennsylvania Railroad station was, to continue their journey. This station, it was called Prime Street Station. It was the terminal for the PB&W Railroad, the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. And it was in there that the body of John Brown was bought. And the railroad did something remarkable. They cleared the station, and a reception committee was given charge of moving the body. Right there you see it. I just transcribed this from a Philadelphia newspaper. A reception committee headed by Reverend Furness to receive Mrs. Brown, the widow, and the body. And he did something remarkable. Noticing the crowd outside, the body was put in a box, covered with a coarse blanket, a cloth, and then put into a furniture van. As a hearse went out one entrance as a decoy, the real body passed in an inconspicuous furniture van. So there was no chance for a mob to gather around it, open the coffin, and throw it into the street, which I suspect was the intention, to desecrate the body. So this is a minister who's going to go out there and risk his own life and do something daring. And that sort of impulsive, impetuous action, we'll see, was carried on by his son. And there's the station as it looked. And it was a fantastic station. It was the biggest span that Philadelphia then had. It was about 150 feet wide. How was he able to be given jurisdiction to empty the station? Because the head of the railroad was the man we're honoring today, Samuel Morse Felton. And again, we don't have all the documentation. I suspect, once again, people were being discreet, necessarily discreet, to avoid lawsuit. Felton was a member of this congregation. He was a Unitarian from Massachusetts. And I see right here the beginning of a warm note of friendship and collaboration between these two men, the culmination of which is the window. I'm just looking at it now. I haven't seen it since it's back. Well, that is glorious. Wow. What about Frank? Frank was too impatient to go to Harvard. Look at him. Look at that soldierly stride. Look at him bounding down the streets, soldier squared. This tells you right away that he's a cavalryman, and he spent 3.5 years in the Civil War on horseback. He was wrenched from his architecture studios. He was studying in this building at West 10th Street, built by his mentor, Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to study in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. This is America's first purpose-built art studio. Hunt taught his pupils above. The rest of the building was rented by painters, famous painters, such as Frederick Church had a great studio here, and so did John LaFarge, starting in 1859, the year that Furness arrived. And this is the beginning of the relationship between LaFarge and Furness. There's a view of the atelier room upstairs where Furness, I don't think that's Furness, but this place was the Petri dish out of which emerged many of the leading architects of the next half a century. George Post, Gambrel, who was partner of Richardson, William Ware, Henry Van Brunt, and others. The two Hunt brothers were an extraordinary duo. Richard, there on the left, went to the École des Beaux-Arts to study architecture. His brother William went over to study painting and became the most important American pupil of Millet. You know from the Agnellis, you know from many pictures of pious rustic scenes. In the summer of 1860, Richard got sick. He retired from business for the whole summer, and he sent his pupils to Newport to work in the atelier of his brother. He thought it would be good for them to spend 3 months learning painting. Furness did that, and so it turns out, did young John LaFarge, and we have a great image of that. Here is John LaFarge painted by Hunt. And you see a little, if you've looked at Millet, you see some of the influence of Millet passing through Hunt. The idea of suppressing detail to get the energy and power of the figure in a simplified but compact silhouette. So Furness is there, LaFarge is there, and for a time Henry James is there. Henry James and William James, his brother, at the beginning of their careers dabbled in art. And if you read a Henry James novel and you're struck by the aesthetic quality of it, closely observed fine detail made expressive through form, you see, I think, the lingering aftershocks of a term with a great painter. Now, the war breaks out shortly after the inauguration of Lincoln, the firing of the first shots at Fort Sumter, and Frank Furness goes in a matter of weeks from being an architect to a soldier. All he's done at first is he's changed his clothes. You still see the diffident young man at the beginning of his life's journey. And then the violence began. The violence began without interruption. He served as a cavalry captain in Russia's Lancers, an elite cavalry unit recruited from the sons of privileged Philadelphia families. And they fought the Gothic revival on horseback. That is, this is not the Gothic revival in making a building. This is the Gothic revival of jousting matches, because they were the only regiment of the war, Confederate or Union, that actually rode into battle with lances. Bad idea, and around the time of Gettysburg, they were discreetly withdrawn. Furness's heroism is attested in many events. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery at the Battle of Trevilian Station, hoisting a box of ammo on his head and carrying it over an open field to a surrounded farmhouse, while bullets from all sides aimed at him. So he learned courage, but he also we also see the effects of his father's moral training. He also, on one famous occasion, saw a Confederate soldier bleeding to death from a bullet through his thigh, crawled out on his hands and knees, tied a tourniquet around the man, saved his life, and very poignantly, 40 years later, tracked him down to see if he still lived. And he said in a heartbreaking account that he had seen men bleed to death throughout the war, but what struck him about that soldier was as he lay there thinking he was dying, he struggled to wrench himself upright to say a prayer. And it was that sight that brought Frank Furness back to his childhood encounter with his mother, listening to his father's sermons. Well, after the war, he comes to Philadelphia and his powers are unleashed. And I think if we look at his buildings, we see a kind of rampaging militaristic quality, if I can say that. These spiky, pointy, jagged, angular upheavals in brick and stone. His banks, hotels, libraries, train stations. He took particular delight in making pugnacious banks because he's a man fresh from combat. And I think he was attracted to the idea that every bank on a city street is engaged in financial combat. Each one is a tough little fortress warding off bank robbers. Philadelphia had many famous bank robberies in the 1870s. Warding off bank robberies, defying their rivals, and with turrets raised as if to drop boiling oil on check defaulters below, of which the most famous is not a bank, but a remarkable insurance company. This is the Provident Life and Trust. It's a trust company for a Quaker institution that bragged in its public relations that the Provident was a good investment because of the famous healthfulness of Quakers who back then didn't drink, supposedly. This talk is called Modern Color, and I haven't mentioned color yet, but Furness's great debut in Philadelphia is the Academy of Fine Arts, just one block north of Philadelphia City Hall. And this is a building shrill and strident with blazing colors of archaeology, paint, and tile. It's a colorful building, which is appropriate for a building that is itself a paint box with the colors for the art students who come out of it. But the most interesting passage of color, to me, comes right at the cornice. Right up there. Those tiles, we scarcely see them, but it was a brand new invention that had been patented. And there's the patent from May of 1876 by a Philadelphia glassmaker named Thomas Aiken. And there is what his trick was. It was to get several thin layers of glass and back them with gold or silver leaf, have a final corrugated layer of glass at top, so you have indelible permanent color that shimmers in layers almost like the iridescence of a beetle's wing. That was the phrase they used. So this, on one hand, you could say Philadelphia was filthy then, filthier than it ever would be since. It was the coal-burning age. So you wanted a building whose colors were impervious to soot, which they were, but something else is going on. Just to look at some of Furness's his use of color, his delight in the extravagance of color, the sensuousness of color. What is going on is a great change in the possibilities of making color. If you look at a Dutch painting, anything by Rembrandt or his contemporaries, Vermeer, you are looking at essentially what painters call the earth palette, because in this 17th, 18th century, there's only two ways to make a pigment: grind up a rock or grind up a vegetable. That's how you did it. And you get all the impure matter, boil it away as you might, of the original, so the substrate cannot be removed. But beginning in the first couple decades of the 19th century, painters working together with chemists came upon a new series of colors that are much purer, and we call these colors spectral colors or prismatic colors. The purest color you can get is to take a prism hold it over the sidewalk, and break the light of the sun into pure color. There's no impure matter. There's no matter. Pure light. You can't get that when you grind up a rock, but the chemical pigments could approach it clearly, more accurately, and this explains the color explosion of the middle of the 19th century. Americans responded particularly by looking at our autumn, our great landscape. This is also the origin of French Impressionism, which would have been impossible without colors like cadmium yellow and the chromium colors. So this is the color explosion that this building and the glass in it partakes of. And the man who gave us our window, we just mentioned before, the last time we saw him, he was in Newport training with William Hunt. So he'd learned the French approach to painting on murals. LaFarge goes to France himself, learns more. And LaFarge's debut happens about the same time that Furness's debut happens, middle of the century. The Academy opened in 1876 here, and this building opened in Boston in 1877. This is Trinity Church, the great church by H.H. Richardson. And in it, all the great murals of the Old Testament and New Testament prophets, up there at the top I see Nicodemus, were all painted by LaFarge. This is his first chance to do a major building for the public with major art dealing with major themes. And he had the problem of making paintings that would subordinate themselves to the flatness of the wall. And here through Millet and then through Hunt is the lesson of the expressive, powerful silhouette, the delight in color. But you recognize that color in the end is always going to be flat, dead, and opaque. He was intrigued by the idea of making color that glowed from within. And this is why, in his later years at Trinity, he shifted from painting murals to making stained glass. And here is the origin of his great invention, of which this is a stupendous, exquisite example, and that is what he called opalescent glass. And there is a detail of the paint of the stained glass from Trinity Church. You'll notice it's not like medieval stained glass, which tends to be flat shards of clear color. We have medieval type stained glass all on your right. You see that there. The difference with LaFarge's glass is and Kathy Jordan, who restored that magnificently, will talk more about it. So I may make some grotesque errors in my next two sentences. But as I understand it, several thin layers of glass are placed one over another to give depth and translucence to the glass. And something else, it also means you can see them when it's dark outside. They're somewhat opaque and they reflect light, and this is just at the moment the churches are beginning to be lighted by electric lighting. So they work in both ways. And because you're using translucent layers that shimmer, glisten, and gleam with some opacity, you've got more chances for the aesthetic exploration of texture and subtlety. Look at the way that girl's head turns away from you and melts away into shadow. That's an effect you can't get with medieval glass, where edges are always sharp, crisp, and clear, and generally outlined with metal. So the building that the window came to, I said at the beginning, was the product of these two men, Reverend Furness, who was the conscience of the church, and his son, who would be the architect for this building, which the commission for which he received in 1882. And there is his first perspective of it. Fabulous drawing, not a pretentious drawing, straightforward pen and ink drawing, showing the parish house in the back, the church at the front, with its long lost, stubby but muscular tower. All that unpretentious design, made in 1882, and the church opened in 1886. Now, Furness had already built a Unitarian church in Philadelphia. It was the Germantown Church. You can see its successor as you drive up Lincoln Drive, and there it is, building of 1866. From the beginning, Furness was a little willful, a little peculiar. Any other architect would have put the tower at the middle, but Furness flattens it out and swivels it to the side as a kind of two-dimensional billboard. And the plan of that church is very much like the plan of this church. The main thing you notice about it, like this one, it has a pulpit in the middle, there is no central aisle. As there is in a Catholic church, we have a great one down 20th Street, or an Episcopal church, we have a great one down at Locust, or a Presbyterian church, all around. They go against the spirit of Unitarianism, which is a descendant of the Puritan meeting houses of the 17th century. In the middle, the people should be gathered. That this, unlike a Catholic church, what is up here is not an altar with the relic of a saint. What we have here is a gathering place where people assemble together and hear the word spoken persuasively. So Furness does that from the beginning, and I also see it's got an organ on one side, as ours does. So I think when Furness was hired in 1882 to design this church, they said, we would like something much like the one you already did, with a few changes. And there's a view of the Unitarian church torn down in the 1920s, much like this one. It has an acrobatic performance of the wooden truss above. So the roof is honest. It's telling you what it does. It's bragging about what it does a little by the heroic performance of carpentry, but it's honest, as the architecture of a church should be. That one also centered on a pulpit. And there's the view of this one early in its history, essentially showing you the same thing. Now, there are the two plans put side by side. So this is a cruciform plan, but unlike a Catholic church where it's a longitudinal vessel that creates a hierarchy moving you forward, this one is short and compact. It's what's sometimes called a Greek cross, where the four arms are essentially of equal length. Now, there's an odd feature about this church. What the heck is that porch out there? What's it doing? Well, I think, and here we never have actually, when a commission is given within a family, we never have a paper record of it. These things are handled by conversation, but I'm going to speculate. I'm up here at the pulpit. I'm allowed to do that for a few minutes, to speculate. If you look at Reverend Furness's first church, designed by William Strickland, here's a printmaker showing the building, but I suspect that Reverend Furness preferred this image of it, where there are people outside, not one lonely pedestrian, but rather a conversation. The point being that what happens up here in the communication from the minister to the congregation begins something that moves out the door and continues debate. That is, the conversation here doesn't end when you go home and have Sunday lunch. You go out in the street thinking and acting. Now, a Greek portico lets you do that out in the rain, but that's a conventional form. That's a platitude. Furness instead gave you, if you look there at the left, gave you the same form that ancient churches had, the earliest early Christian ones, called a narthex, an outside place to gather and prepare yourselves before you're ready to enter, and then a place for amiable discussion outside. And that was prefaced by that great corner tower. I say it's great. In the 1920s, it was thought to be monstrous, and it was discreetly amputated. Well, that was the anti-Victorian era. I love this photograph of it, showing you just how muscular it was. This is a tower that is so strong, it threatens to be blown apart by its own force. And if you look at the last minute, Furness installed iron ties as if desperately, plaintively, to draw it back together. So he's as you come through the door here, he wants you physically aware, not only spiritually. And there, an early view, they tried to salvage the idea of a portal for a time. And there is the narthex. This is a great photo by the great member of our board, Joe Elliott, whose photos are outstanding. Anyway, Furness designed a color church. He said he wanted it to be a color church. Deep green walls, gold lines, deep red timbers, bronze. The edges of the timber are bronze. We have a recreation of that. There has never yet been done as far as I know, Nick, we can talk about this, it's not been done yet, a systematic color analysis. Nick Tenaglia, he's the conscience of the physical building these days. We haven't yet done a systematic color analysis to bring back the colors that Furness told you about. One other thing about this church, and that view is spectacular, it is oriented exactly north-south, well, as much as the Philadelphia street grid is. Unlike a Christian church of the Middle Ages, which was always oriented to the east, which is redundant because the word orient means to point to the east. That is, that the rising sun on Easter morning recapitulates the ceremony inside. So the sun is very important for traditional Catholic worship. But for Unitarian worship, what is much more important, symbolically, is the sun as an emblem of reason, clarity of thought, moral clarity. So that window is extremely important. Now, as you spend your day here, you will walk around and see some of the scrumptious decorative arts here. The monument to Reverend Furness at the back, works by Frank Miles Day. John J. Boyle, great American sculptor, his bust of Priestley. All around here are stained glass windows by Henry Holliday, personal friend of Frank Furness. All the ones over there, many of them are by Holliday for members of the Furness family. But the one that we're here to celebrate is the one above. And Reverend Abbey talked about the importance of Isaiah. Isaiah, the Old Testament prophet, who's important because much of his teachings can be taken to presage the coming of Christ, the New Testament, but he's also the most ethical of the Old Testament prophets, the one who passed moral judgment on a corrupt age, which is something that would have resonated with Unitarians, and Professor Abbey talked about the stress on social justice historically and today in this church. So we have in front of us LaFarge, and you have in front of you Tiffany. And what is great about this, what is fantastic about this, and what is hilarious about this is that these two men began as friends and they ended up suing each other because Tiffany was the pupil of LaFarge who learned from him his technique of stained glass, and the two of them innovated their own systems for opalescent glass. Similar but different. Each one patented his own system, and it turns out, as they tried to drag each other into court, to make the windows properly, you had to use both the patents, which didn't work if the two men weren't speaking with each other. So I like the idea that here they're speaking to each other, but with a court restraining order that keeps them 100 feet apart. Now, look where the window is. The window faces south. That means the light of the sun is being brought here. So what should be up there bringing the light? Well, it should not be the light. Let me just give you the background history, which will be the subject of today. When Sam Felton died in 1889, it was natural that the family would want a memorial for him. Furness had worked for Felton before. I suspect he may have done more work we don't know about it. One thing I do know is the Ridley Park Hotel of 1871 there, commissioned by Felton, was designed by Frank Furness. Why did they get LaFarge to do that window? That's the rose window, the circular window that is beneath the gable of the main entrance of a church. I suspect it was because the year before he had just done a magnificent one in Albany. This is All Saints Cathedral in Albany, and that rose window by LaFarge depicts the saints in glory. And it's glorious, but not for a Unitarian church. Saints don't play much of a role in the Unitarian church, but prophets who admonish us do. And the prophet Isaiah, as we've just seen, is the choice. He could be the only choice, really, for a Unitarian church at this moment. Typically medieval images, mosaics, there's one, Siena by Duccio, typically medieval images of Isaiah show him holding his text, the book of Isaiah. But the model for LaFarge is the greatest model we have, Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. And what I love about this is the torque. Isaiah is turning. He's turning towards his book, but his head goes the other direction as an angel speaks to him. That is, he has old knowledge, but he's hearing something new. So for the Pope, this is satisfying. It shows the Old Testament prophet, and the angel whispers, but prepare for the coming of Christ. So we have the body itself turning in action. Incidentally, that is one of the great poses in art history, and you will see many, many, many quotations of it. Let me show you my favorite. Well, that is now my favorite. Let me show you my second favorite. This is Norman Rockwell. Rosie the Riveter. One of the greatest images of the liberation of women in World War II. Yes. That deserves a standing ovation. I love the way Rockwell puts a sandwich in her hand in place of the book of Isaiah, her lunchbox, and instead of standing on a bracket, she's standing, can you see, it's a copy of Mein Kampf, beneath her sturdy workman's boots. It's just a fantastic image. And that's what we have got up there. So I'm going to wrap it up because I've already gone over my time. This is the source of it, but let me leave you with a thought. Look at that. Think of it as a study in color, study in theology. Think of it, the morality it depicts. Think of where it is physically in the building. And think of it finally as a symbol of turning to the light, because it comes right below Furness's message to you to turn to the light, because just below the apex of the gable is a frieze of roses, and if you look at them, they turn from east to west, following the path of the sun. They follow the light. You should follow the light, as did the four men who created this building. Thank you.